So good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for coming to the session 8 of the Ricolto EcoAg ILM training. Today's session is on integrated landscape finance tools and approaches. It's a continuation of our session on Tuesday, the introduction to landscape finance. We're here today with Juan Carlos Ramos from EcoAg, who's our finance person extraordinaire, and I think he's going to be great to add richness to the concept and really help us dig into the foundations of what this all means. Can you go to the next slide, please, Juan? So just to show you guys where we are on the training program, we've been through Intro to ILM. We've talked about the different elements of the ILM framework. We've talked a little bit about the importance of working with the ideas of inclusion and diversity, and really being as inclusive as possible when thinking about all of the landscape, all of the participants in the landscape project. We talked a lot about stakeholder identification and engagement. So after you've identified all of these stakeholders, trying to be as inclusive as possible, how do you bring them in to the project? How do you get them a little bit closer to the process that you're doing? And then we talked a little bit about governance in the landscape partnerships, how to do a cross-sectoral or multi-stakeholder governance and the different ways we can do that. And then later in April, we looked at the shared vision. So once you've identified all of the stakeholders, once you have engaged them in your process, and you've thought about your governance structure, then it's time to bring everybody together to think about a shared vision, a common purpose for the landscape. And then we moved in April finally to what is integrated landscape finance. And today we're going to dive into looking a little bit about the tools and approaches of landscape finance. You can go into the next one, please, Juan. As always, so actually I don't know if this is as relevant today because we're such a small group. I hope everybody can keep their camera on, and I don't think you even need to, feel free to raise your hand. We can speak a little bit more interactively because we're such a small group. We can be in plenary a bit more than usual, but please engage as much as you like, try to interact. This is really a space for us to be together as the Ricolto team, for you guys to share your experiences. So please feel free to turn your cameras on, raise your hands, chat, interact as much as possible. So the next slide is the EcoAg team who's here with us today. You already know me, but this is Juan. I'm going to hand it over to Juan for him to introduce himself and then take it over. Juan, over to you.
Thanks, Patricia, and hi, everyone. My name is Juan Carlos Ramos. I'm based in Guatemala, and I work on topics of integrated landscape finance and public policy at Eco Agriculture Partners and the 1,000 Landscapes Initiative. I focus mostly in Latin America. So we're supporting several kind of landscape finance accelerator process in a couple of landscapes, particularly in San Martin, Peru, in Alto Mayo, and in Jalisco, Sierra Tapalpa, Mexico, with Rainforest Alliance and Conservation International, where we're going through basically a process of integrated landscape finance, which I think Seth gave an introduction to on Tuesday, and we'll go into a bit more depth now. And very linked, I think, to the finance component is also questions of public policy and public finance that enable a lot of the work that's done in multi-stakeholder platforms, and particularly value chain approaches. And so we can kind of dive into it kind of right away. A bit of a background on myself is that I trained in economics and also sustainable finance. I worked at the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Wildlife Fund, South Pole, and EY in different finance-ish roles, and ended up at EcoAg trying to bring that together to think about how to mobilize resources for multiple sectors and multiple use cases, which is not easy, but at the end of the day, I think to succeed in the sustainability approaches that we're working on is kind of necessary. So yeah, let's kind of dive into a bit of the agenda for today. So the first bit is going to be basically, as Patricia was saying, doing a recap of everything integrated landscape finance, particularly the key components that Seth talked about. Make sure that we're all on the same page, that you've understood kind of most of those key concepts. then move into a bit more of kind of the practical element of what does it really mean to begin that process and develop a portfolio of projects and activities. And then finally introduce a bit of a tool to systematize and think about what are the different elements to consider when you're thinking about landscape finance within a given territory or context. So again, this is kind of a bit of the agenda we have. For the coffee break, I think we're going to be a bit dynamic depending on where we get to in the halfway mark, and also depending on your interest. Please do interrupt me at any point if you want to talk about anything, raise your hand, ask a question. Since we're a small group, it's a bit easier since we can have a lot more of an exchange. So I'd encourage anyone who feels like they have a question to bring it basically right away. Okay, perfect. So I think the first point I think to start in, and I wasn't at the session that Seth facilitated on Tuesday, and I work very closely with Seth, the host. So if you have any question, is there anything that was not clear that you would like to discuss more? So I want to start there. Actually, stop sharing my screen for a second to see if yeah, for anyone that's here, is there anything that was unclear from Tuesday that you want to talk about?
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, Charlotte. I really kind of end up feeling like I got kind of lost a little bit last Tuesday, or confused more than lost. I don't know if I couldn't never understand the point, or I couldn't make myself clear about my questions, but I'm not sure the finance part, like maybe I was looking at it from the local level, and I'm not sure if there is more like a macro finance level that we have to look at concerning policies and grants and other type of funding that come from not the same partners or allies in the landscape. So I'm not sure if I was really clear in all where the fundings come from, or what Seth was telling us was a different thing from what I was thinking. So I got kind of confused about the funding and the activities and how the consortium will work. If they should have like a basket or piggy bank where they all bring some funding from their institution organizations, including the government, or should the platform should look for funding outside from the landscape members. So not sure if I kind of like would like to see what is your point of view regarding funding and how they would be the best work to approach it.
Hey Juan, could I make a suggestion? Since we're such a small group, maybe we could do a round robin and have Maffy and Lillian and Harold and Norvin also tell us their questions, and then at the end we could have a discussion with all of them. Would that work?
That'd be great.
Does that sound good to you guys? Maffy, Lillian, Harold, Norvin? Do you guys, yeah? Maffy, would you like to share first?
Hi, thank you. Yes, of course. Yes, I think I'm feeling a little bit more like Raúl. Like I think it's like tricky when you share this platform, if everyone puts a little bit of money to do things, or if you can have like a fund for the platform. Is like that is like if, or you can do both. If you like gather together some budget and also make like a proposal for funding. That would be. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Maffy. Lillian, Harold, Norvin? I'm not asking you, Charlotte, because you weren't here, but if you have anything to share based on the recording, please do as well.
I would just like to add something that, especially in this since we have limited resources or strategic budgets, what you usually do sometimes is, at least at the beginning, sometimes Ricardo is the one who is like motivating people to get together. And then some of the partners or allies in that landscape take charge or turns in pay for some activities. Probably the best way should be if there is, because to have a common fund, they will have to have a legal status. So that becomes a little tricky as well. So usually each partner pays for some of the activities that we all have agreed on. So just to have an idea what is happening in these landscapes.
Mhm. Norvin, do you have any comments or any, would you like to share your muddiest point from the last session? Or Lillian, Harold?
Yes, for me, this is Harold. I'm Harold. So for me, is to I'm wondering how can we sustain the landscape financially, because if the contribution comes from each partner, that means at the end, it comes at each partner. I feel that it can be more sustainable. But if it's through funding, then when the project funds ends because it's time limited, that being said, there won't be more funding. So my concern is just how to sustain the cash flow. Yeah, these are just my thought.
And from my side, I don't really have any discussions because I wasn't in the last sessions. I've read the notes and I mean the slides. It was quite clear, but I don't have anything else to add to what the colleagues have just said.
All right, thanks, Charlotte. Would anyone else like to share?
Yeah, good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon, Charlotte and others. For me, both levels are important. Most of the time is funds for activities are joined with a small contribution from the different members on the platform to execute the different actions, include planned the actions that was prioritized for the all members in the platform. In my experience is the activities prioritized in the local form, the prioritized.
Thanks, Norvin. Juan, what do you think?
No, I mean, everything you're saying is of course kind of at the crux of the question of integrated landscape finance. I think a bit of the importance is that finance from a multi-sector, multi-scale perspective like this is something that you need to think about and approach as a process. And it's very much dependent on the goals and the objectives you have, the stakeholders you have, the legal frameworks, and the existing finance in a place that you want to mobilize. And so it's important to, I think Raul was saying, kind of when you're thinking about mobilizing local finance versus other scales of finance, you should always mobilize what's most accessible to you. If it's more difficult to get other forms of finance, it's less likely you'll be able to do it effectively if you're not ready to actually absorb that, to develop instruments or mechanisms to channel that money, or to kind of deal with a bit more of the complexity. And Raul was saying, or I think a point that was made by others was also the question of centralizing funds into a partner or something that's legally designated is a very important question, and it's not insignificant either. If you have an entity that's going to be managing funds, there's a lot of capacity required also on financial management and reporting to be able to do that effectively and well. And so the role that Ricolto, I think, sometimes plays as facilitating or organizing and coordinating these platforms for different objectives. Sometimes from a finance perspective, it's not that you need to centrally raise funds or centrally distribute funds. It can also simply be about making more sense about where projects, activities, and finance should be going rather than having to manage it just on your own. And what I mean by that in particular with the public sector and public finance is that very few people think in more of a integrated way or trying to connect different projects and pieces. And so if you're creating a bit more coherence in a certain territory or sector, you can help to redirect financial flows and funding from projects, but also from investments into a more common set of objectives. And kind of a bit of the previous modules that Patricia and other colleagues have given is really creating that shared objective, that shared vision, kind of shared activities. Different partner contributions can help to maintain and create evidence in relation to that. And over time, you want to be able to build up support and also finance going to these things. But it's unlikely, and we'll talk a bit more about it in the session, that you'll just get funding to do the things that you want to do without having more evidence, without having more of a track record, without having more information, and also without really having trust of the different stakeholders that are there. And even for private sector finance or mobilizing larger flows of international finance, there's a lot of trust that's required to substantiate that money being committed to these things. And what I mean by that is that, particularly in the financial context, there's really only two variables that matter. So the first one is risk, and the second one is return. And risk is really just a quantification of trust. How much do they trust that you can pay something back, that it makes sense to them as an institution? And really the same thing applies for a lot of philanthropic donations, grants, and funding, which is if you're aligned on what they want to do they trust you'll be able to implement it? And at what scale do they think you'll be able to implement it? And so it's important, again, this is why I mentioned at the beginning, to think about all of this as a process, because you need to be able to develop that track record over time. You need to be able to actually prove that you can be successful at implementing those things. And you need to, I think, be able to substantiate a lot of the times this shared vision and the importance of shared objectives to mobilize people towards this and see tangible, real results over time. And so at the first level, kind of you can mobilize the funds that exist, but then you need to actually think about, to really achieve all of your shared objectives, to really reach the goals that you have set out for your platform in your territory, you need to actually do the work to analyze how much money, funding do you need to really do all of those things. Because it's one thing to say, we need to restore 80,000 hectares, for example, in watershed to do this thing. And right now we're restoring 1,000. And what does it actually mean if you want to restore all of the 80,000? How much money does that take? Who can do it? How long would it actually take to do? And where do you get money to move from 1,000 to 80,000? And that question, not just on restoration, but on other components, particularly if we're working on food systems like Ricolto is, and you're thinking about what is the value add processing that we require for this to become more sustainable, to have more value add, to incentivize better practices, to look at urban-rural linkages to see how you can connect markets from this area to another area. All of that is even more complicated because it's not just about individual one entry point implementation. It's multiple entry point implementation. It's thinking about how much funding and financing do you need across the value chain and across connecting even different territories to make these things more sustainable. And that requires a lot more analytical components from the finance side, because you can do project implementation activities for certain parts of that. But as you're mentioning, the sustainability of certain approaches are entirely dependent on the incentives and the incentive mix that you'll have, which is basically what is the reward or the punishment that anyone gets for the things that they're doing. And particularly for more sustainable food systems, generally that's, does a farmer actually get better prices for when they sell a product that's more or less sustainable? Are they actually valued more because it's a better quality product that's focused on better practices, agroecology, agroforestry, or is the market actually not compensating those things? And then kind of on the flip side, not only is it on the market side, but on the production side, is the farmer actually supported? Do they have the support systems, infrastructure, technical assistance, even logistics in place to actually sustain doing more sustainable practices? And then how are you actually connecting that across the value chain addition? And all of those are individual investments that you need to be thinking about and costing out, and then thinking about connecting to the different forms of finance. So that's kind of, this is why I think the whole point of all of my intervention is to really underline, you need to think about it as a process, because you can't do all of those things at once. So you need to start at a simple point. You need to start accessing and mobilizing the money, the funding, the instruments that's most easily available, but you can't just stop there, even though that's difficult. You need to then think about, okay, then if we're here, what's the next step? Is the key thing here to sustain this initial funding pool, these initial set of activities, or is it really expanding our focus and the amount of impact we're having right now to do more things? And the answer to that is, of course, different depending on the context and the role that even Ricolto wants to play in a different context. If you want to maintain more of a facilitation and facilitator role so that you bring people together and it's more about making sense of a system that's dynamic and complex like food systems, and like making something more sustainable over time, it's not necessary that you have to like think about how you fund everything, but you should be getting other people to think about it. You should be telling the public sector, look, with all of our project activities, with all of our partners, here's where we get to. And from the goal that you have of restoring or watershed management or better flows of ecosystem services, we maybe get to 10%. And so the public sector needs to fund a lot more than 10% than what we can do. And so how do you mobilize other actors towards that? And this is why kind of when we look at integrated landscape finance, it's also not just about money and instruments and sources. It's also about the process to make sure that people understand where they should be investing and putting more money in across a territory, across a value chain, so that that makes much more sense. So a bit of kind of, thank you, Patricia, for the slide that you're putting up. We've developed kind of like support in how to approach this process so that you can connect it, and it's entirely linked and entirely a part of integrated landscape management. The finance component is just like thinking about that within your larger process of, you know, developing needs, bringing stakeholders together, developing a shared vision and plan, having an action plan where you're identifying what are the actual needs you have to implement your action plan. And then how do you identify, access, or develop different instruments or mechanisms, which could basically be a grant. It could basically be a donation. It could be partner contributions, or it can be more complicated things like working with the government to do subsidies, or working with a local bank so that they can support smallholder farmers to do better practices, or going even more complicated beyond that. But at its most basic level, the logic is to always start where you can make progress rather than just try to do things that may be a bit too difficult and complicated that won't have results. And then after that, it's mobilizing finance, but and here's the kind of the most important thing is that it's not necessarily the amount of money that matters. It's really that the money is going to the right places, to the right people, to do the right things. And that's an important distinction that particularly when you're thinking about local resources, local partners, sometimes it's even not necessarily the financial resources that you're trying to mobilize, it's actually the actions of these partner organizations that provide non-financial resources like physical labor to do things from a volunteer basis. And that's arguably more important sometimes than just mobilizing money from something that comes with strings attached. So I'll stop there and kind of through the slides and everything that we have, hopefully that should become more clear through the end of the session.
Thanks, Juan. That was great. Should we go back to the first part of the slides?
Yes, can everyone see my screen here?
Yeah,
Thanks, Juan.
I can see it.
So having kind of a quick recap of the theoretical part of integrated landscape finance, again, kind of as we're describing, the important thing is here that what makes this different than traditional finance is we're thinking about connecting different pieces. And so it's not just about different things in isolation, it's about thinking about the process of how these things connect and over time, how you can make funding and ideally a plan bring these things together to have real sustainability. Now, when we're thinking about finance, kind of at some of its most simple terms, it's everything as it relates to accessing and managing money. And it really depends on what kind of finance you have, who's giving you the money, what they're giving you for, and what conditions are attached to it. So generally at its kind of like the more basic levels is that finance or funding that comes through grants or public funding may sometimes be considered free, but it's free generally in relation to you doing something for it. So if you have a grant, you're committing sometimes basically in a contract to do a certain set of things, and that's what the money is for. And in public finance instruments, sometimes it's something similar where you're agreeing to implement something through government funding that if you don't do, you're basically breaking a contract. On the flip side, kind of on the private end, it's very similar. It's just structured slightly differently with a different perspective. So not-for-profit donations, grants, or public finance instruments have the conditions attached to them. They're never really free, in my opinion. And for-profit ones are the same. It's just that they're not free in a different way. They basically require or ask for more money in return so that you're paying for having a benefit of getting money at a certain period of time. And then with that, you're basically paying that with more money depending on how much more time you kept the money. And then you're paying for the time that you have that money that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to access. So this is basically the concept of the time value of money, where money has value because you can use it and you can generate other things with it. And so you're paying for being able to access it where you otherwise wouldn't have it. And so there can be shorter debt or shorter loans or longer term loans. It's very dependent on the risk or the trust that the person or the institution giving you this debt or this loan has in you or your sector or your ability to repay in how high the interest rate will be. And so it's important to differentiate here that, for example, when a smallholder farmer or agriculture gets loans, they tend to be a lot more expensive, unfortunately. And they're a lot more expensive because from the perspective of the bank or the financial institution, it's more expensive actually to manage and to analyze the risk or the trust they can have in you paying back the loan in agriculture versus if it's with a big company that has paid a lot of things, that pays a lot of things, that has a lot of revenue and cash flows, they will get a cheaper percentage loan because they're seen as more trustworthy. Now, it's important to recognize that in traditional finance, there is no thinking about the impact or the sustainability of what's happening or what's going on. So in some cases, you'll have loans or debts which are basically subsidized, and subsidized means that they're supported by someone else to make the loan or the interest rate less expensive. And so a risk guarantee or insurance is one way of doing that, where someone basically says they want to help mobilize or help certain sectors or a certain area get more money because they want to have more growth or incentivize more happening in that area. And so they'll try to make basically loans and debt less expensive so that people are more willing to take on that debt, and also the institutions that have the money are more willing to give it out. So that could look like basically a government that has a subsidy program for agriculture, and they want to incentivize people doing more agriculture, and so they pay banks or they give other kind of instruments so that the risk levels for the banks and the financial institutions is lower, and that people are more willing to take on that debt. Okay, so that's kind of the explanations for the last two and the first one. Equity, I'll talk about very shortly, and it's very simple. Equity is basically the concept that you're buying property or a percentage of the property of a company or of a venture that's ongoing. And that could basically be you have a farm that's a company, and instead of giving you a loan, I offer to buy a certain part of that company, and in exchange, kind of, I can, being a shared owner of that company, be more involved in how it's managed and also kind of the profits that are received over time. So that's kind of the basis of what equity is. Equity is simply buying a percentage of the ownership of something. And so you then have equity of something when you're buying a percentage of that company or of that venture or of that organization or institution. You're basically buying an equity share in it. And these are basically the main mechanisms in which everything else is built on. So any more complicated instrument or mechanism that you can think about in finance are all based on these things. It's just different mixes of them. But the most common ones are obviously a loan or a debt that can happen at small and larger pools. And then grants and public finance instruments are also kind of the most common because that's how the governments spend their money basically directly in different ways. Okay. So I want to stop there to see if anyone has any questions on this.
I just wanted to see if I kind of get it right. Whatever we do especially what our role first is to promote and facilitate these spaces to create this partnership or consortium with people in that specific area or landscape. So the small actions that we do, they could come from money from different actors. And even then, even some of them can come in they are helping with different kind of activities, even though they don't represent a cash flow. And then, since what I understand is a process, but it will take some time to build some trust, and you measure the risk of dealing with other partners around. in the same landscape and having a shared common goal to achieve different things that will benefit that landscape. Probably up to that point, they could get together and start creating opportunities to access to different kind of money. And in some cases, I believe that the best way, if we go back to the matrix about interest and power, probably the ones leading will be like the one who have both, and are on the high end of the quadrant, and the right one that have high interest and high power, so they can pull together all the different actors, giving them some participation to the small ones, not so they won't feel left out, even if they don't have the financial resources to contribute to specific activities. So once we have established these stakeholders and they believe and they trust each other, to apply for grants or those kind of stuff, they will have to have a legal status, as I said, but they could do it in an individual way, but looking at the common goals to achieve those goals they have set up as a platform. So I'm not sure if now I have a little more clear idea if that's what you were talking in the last few minutes, or just give me some feedback.
Yeah, no, I think you summed it up very well. And I think that the important thing is that for the finance component, or like how you're funding all of those things, it's important to keep in mind that if you want to get to the higher theory of change or theory of transformation that you might have for a territory or for a place, it's essential to recognize you cannot do it alone. And even as you grow a platform or a multi-stakeholder process, it's likely that you will still need to mobilize other actors for more. And so how you plan that process beyond even the people that are just at the table, but having that table gives you a lot more legitimacy. So we've seen over time that sometimes the place, particularly in Latin America, where you can mobilize the most is with local government, where if local government sees and starts to understand what you're doing, they see the progress that you're making, they see the trust that different stakeholders have, they start to think about, and you can start to think about with the government, how to institutionalize certain things to make them more sustainable. So even, for example, in the context that we have in Mexico, in Sierra de Tapalpa, they're now creating a legal figure within the government, which is basically the multi-stakeholder platform or landscape partnership, as a legal designation that can access priority funds through the Ministry of Environment, and with the approval and support from several different municipalities within the region. And so they got to that point because they worked to develop this platform. They had shared objectives. They mobilized different people to do that. And then they basically worked with the government to say, we need to do more of this and we need more money to do it. But we cannot do this alone. And the government clearly has a mandate, the responsibility to implement and to do more of these things that we're trying to do. So what can you do, or how can we work together? And over time, it wasn't a short-term process. Again, it's not from one day to another, someone signed a paper and it existed. It took them 3 to 4 years to get to that point. But now they're going to have money to maintain at least the multi-stakeholder platform for ever, basically, until the government runs out of money. And on top of that, they can now access money through public finance and through the government to implement specific activities, where if the government, for example, has a program on reforestation, the money can flow through the platform and through the actors that are already around the table to implement those actions. And then for other components of, for example, carbon markets and carbon finance, they can do the same thing. So in that process, there are opportunities that can grow and that can be created but you need to have the process well established in most cases for public finance, and not just public finance. There's also a lot of sometimes big companies that want to be more sustainable and want to help these things, but they don't have time to think about it. So they want to be involved in these kinds of process to contribute in a way that makes sense for them. And so that's why kind of the process you're describing does really help to get to that point. It's just, it's not easy, it's not simple, and it takes time.
I just wanted to add something that you mentioned. I think is really important is to raise that key point about the Commonwealth of Municipalities, because usually they have the expertise, they have some fundings already, they are known for executing different projects, and they have a established relationship with different actors in the area and with the international community as well. So I think you raised that point that is really, really important for them to lead, and that gives another important point that will be sustainability.
No, 100%. And I think that in many cases, it's very important to be very careful and to work with the public sector, because they're the ones who are actually in charge. And sometimes it's easy to forget that. Even if it's not good all of the time and that there are issues on transparency, they still make the rules. And if they change the rule book from one day to the next, a lot of processes can fall apart because the rules have been changed. And in Latin America in particular, that's happened quite a bit. And so it's important to be careful, even if it's hard, and particularly hard in Latin America. Yes, Charlotte, you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Juan. And yeah, I'm sure what you've just said resonated with Raul's history as well, with the work we do with Abu Prolago, for instance, which is also an association of municipalities near Lake Yohoa. No, my question was more in relation to the second point that you kind of raised in your answer, which has to do with the private sector investment. Because in a lot of the landscapes where we work, I mean, these are landscapes that have strong natural areas, but also have they're also productive. So they're usually cocoa producing regions, coffee producing regions, and there's obviously also an interest from, as you said, the companies to invest in sustainability there, if only for the international commitments, and also, I mean, if they're smart, to protect the resource base that this whole production area depends on. And I wanted to hear from you if you have any examples from practice of landscapes where there was really this kind of meaningful investment from private companies, and how did the kind of landscape partnership navigate the kind of potential ethical issues that may come with it, and the potential conflicts of interest, because you don't want one set of interests to become dominant, because obviously landscape partnerships have to navigate all of those. So I'm just curious to hear how that was managed, and also if it's a bad example, we can also learn from bad example. It doesn't need to be only the exemplary ones.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'd caveat by saying that it's when, as you're mentioning, when you're talking about private sector investment, there's a lot of push to get it from a lot of places, and everyone wants to see it. And you also need to be very careful because all of the reasons we already know, like ethically, and also from a power relationship perspective, it's very easy for large companies to dominate conversations because they have a lot of money and resources to do a lot of things. And in a lot of scenarios, they also have very close relationships with government that are hard to navigate. That being said, there are it's important to work through the incentive structure and the risks that companies are facing to engage meaningfully with them. And what I mean by that is that you can sometimes get like social responsibility investments from companies that aren't material to them. And what that means is like they'll give you free money to put it on their report, but they don't really care about what happens with the money, where it goes. They're just thinking about like buying goodwill, basically. On the flip side, right now, particularly with the EU, like deforestation regulations and everything for commodity sourcing and everything, they now need to think more seriously about the risks, even from a regulatory perspective, and how they're managing them. And a lot of those risks, particularly for deforestation of cacao, coffee, etc., they can't control, but it definitely can affect them. And so if you want them to co-invest into a landscape more meaningfully, you need to really have a dialogue with them to understand what is it that they want to avoid, or what is that they want to promote, and how that aligns with your shared objectives, with your shared interests, so that you can mobilize it in that direction rather than the other way around, which could basically be a company showing up and saying, I want everyone to do these things and I have money to do it. And so we should just do this. And that has and can happen. There are some multi-stakeholder platforms, which I'm sure you're aware of, that are funded and completely managed by companies. And their objective is basically that, is like, how can I manage my risk? So examples of companies investing into landscapes, I'll use the same Mexico example in Sierra de Palpa because it's a landscape that's dominated by private sector production. Basically, aguacate, agave, different forms of rice and berries, mainly for export markets. And they are very worried about water availability because everyone uses water, but there's not really a regulation or a control of how much water is everyone using, how much water is still available, how are we managing, areas for recharging. None of it exists. And so all of the companies are really worried, and they've invested internally in their own practices for irrigation or for being more sustainable, but they know it's not enough. And so with kind of this multi-stakeholder process, what Rainforest Alliance kind of did, as playing a similar role to Recolto as a facilitator, was bring the companies and talk to them to say, how can we work together to work on this water issue? Because you have it, the communities have it, the governments also have it. So how can we define and then really clearly set objectives and priorities and investment areas for improving that? And so what they've managed to do in that case, particularly for the water issue, is that they redirected funding and projects that the private sector had in very like random, not necessarily well thought out ways, to then redirect everything to, here are the key restoration areas we need to improve for water capture and catchment areas. And this is what we need to really focus on if we want to like do the water issue. So even projects that companies had like near their company like headquarters and things like that in production areas got immediately redirected, and it's really significant amounts of trees in the hundreds of thousands to those restoration areas, because they were able to get them to understand, if water is really our issue, the places that we need to work together on aren't like random, just like planting trees. It's investing in these key restoration areas, because this is where water kind of can get stored and incremented for a lot of this production landscape areas. There are also like a lot of examples like Nescafe, Starbucks, and others that they're not as public, but they do make investments into priority landscapes to support smallholder farmer practices on like productivity and more resiliency, improving genetic materials for coffee in a lot of cases. And Starbucks has a very big and large program on that, which unfortunately isn't very well spatially targeted. Sometimes they just have a region where it's a priority because this is where my sourcing area is. Let's just give it to as many organizations as we can find. If you can actually get them to see that you're working on a broader multi-stakeholder, multi-sector plan, thinking about more sustainability, in many cases that is really interesting to attract their attention, because it also talks to the sustainability of the money they're investing into. So Starbucks, for example, in Peru, in the Alto Mayo landscape, they've made significant investments into the coffee sectors and even buying carbon from protected areas next to those areas, because they see that there's a plan. They see that people are acting in coordinated ways. There's more social infrastructure and trust. And so they've continuously put millions of dollars into this landscape over around the 10-year period now. But it's because in the first 10 years, Conservation International worked on developing a lot of these things. They focused on coffee, on productivity, and then they were proving the case to Starbucks over time.
If I can just react to that last bit, you know, they have built the evidence over time. I think that's a really important element, and I'm wondering from your experience, what's the kind of evidence that these companies would respond to the best, like the most? What are the kind of key criteria that they would find the most convincing in targeting then the right landscapes, the right areas, rather than just, you know, focus on their own production areas?
Right. So, I mean, I think it's important, I think on the first side, for a company like Starbucks, they don't have production areas. They don't produce coffee, they buy coffee. And so they need to figure out, and it's a big existential question for them with climate change now. Where can I continue buying? If all of these projections are true, and if there are going to be more and more years where the production areas where I buy from are affected, how am I going to continue meeting demand? So from a business perspective, kind of like at its core area, there's that. So to answer that question, you can actually sometimes ask them directly, like, what are you actually looking for? If you don't necessarily have that relationship at the beginning, mainly it's that if you can geo-reference that coffee production or cacao production in this territory is here, and we know that there are X amount of farmers producing X amount of cacao, and we know that that's at risk, that's already an interesting starting point. Because if you can have the geo-referencing, first, that's one of the requirements actually for the EU deforestation regulations going in, that you have a geo-reference of where you're sourcing from, making sure that those don't overlap with protected areas, and you know, all of the other things that are in the law. But that's already a key starting point that the company is unlikely to do on their own. Like the company's not just going to go into places and start like mapping farmers to see where cacao is. Ethically, probably not something they're able to do, and legally, probably an issue. So on the flip side, if you can facilitate a process where you have a lot of that data and that information, and you can present it to basically say, look, there are X amount of farmers here. A lot of them are doing cacao. We also know that a lot of them are considering not doing cacao anymore. So if you're buying cacao from this place, you should think about how we need to invest or co-invest into the area. And here are a lot of things that are already happening, that are already doing that you can co-invest into. And that's a really important point on evidence also, is that particularly for companies don't want to do things alone, particularly in places where the risk for them reputationally if something goes wrong is really high, and particularly in these sectors. If you do something in like cacao and like, oh, they're investing in a landscape, and suddenly there's a massive scandal there and they were the only ones doing it, all of it falls on them. So the platforms and everything are also ways for them to see less risk in doing some of these things, because it's not just them doing it. There are other people involved. And yeah, like that's part of the evidence. And it's with the private sector, it's also important to see that this isn't the public sector. So it's not policy evidence you don't need like the exactness to support like a public policy intervention or decision. It's basically making the case like, look, this affects how much money you can make or that you won't make. And that's it. Like that's all they really, that's really going to be the decision making.
It's the bottom line, eh? Yeah.
Yeah. So that makes it simple sometimes, which is a good thing. Because then it's very clear. It's like, look, these are clear-cut investments you need to make because you have risks associated. And here's the way that we can think about managing those risks with co-investment from your side to really make this progress in some way. So yeah, that's what I'd say kind of as a general.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
Thank you, it's clear.
Folks, can I, so we're at the halfway mark now. We've had a really good discussion. This has been great, but I'm wondering whether we should, well, first stop for a break, and then when we come back, think about where we want to restart the presentation. Maybe we jump straight into the breakout groups. What do you think, Juan?
I think I can go quickly through the other slides. I think it was important to start here though, because
Yeah.
it creates a foundation to understand that, you know, money flows through different places. If you start with public finance, it's a very different thing than trying to do private sector investment because the motivations are also different. So I think we can start from that point, and then I can quickly go through the quick recap and then go straight into the breakout groups, because I think it coincides with what Raul and Charlotte are saying is like, what are you really trying to get into the landscape, or what are you trying to mobilize? And that's different, you know, depending on the landscape, depending on the value chain, and also just depending on the geography sometimes, where public and private are more or less involved.
Yes. All right, so should we take a 5-minute break and then regroup? All right, so it's 8:34 for me, so 8:39 or whatever hour 39 it is for you guys. Grab some coffee, stretch. All right, we're back. Juan, over to you.
Great, let me just share my screen here. Okay, so as I was saying, kind of, we're talking about finance, the different mechanisms, and it's important, as always, to just differentiate between them and understand that there's different requirements for each of them, basically. So when we're talking more about integrated finance, it's basically what Raul was saying, which is this process of planning, coordinating, and accessing funds kind of with this shared vision or shared objectives by different stakeholders, and then implementing them in different ways. There's no centralized function here, because it's really more about mobilizing actions, funding, and resources. And that includes, and that's really, really important, it includes non-financial resources too. Even if we talk about finance in the sense, to really achieve your objectives, you really actually have to motivate people to do things. And a lot of that isn't necessarily remunerated or has a financial contract. So this is just kind of like a quick connection slide, so that all of this is really placed within the context of integrated landscape management, in the context of a territory, of a landscape, and so that you're really mobilizing towards a shared objective within this context. And that has its nuances. So as I'm saying, kind of like in that context of mobilizing towards systemic integrated change within a territorial landscape, it involves different kinds of activities, different kinds of projects, different kinds of investments, different kinds of infrastructure. And here, you know, you can basically see on the slide kind of all of the different actors that are involved in this, which make it not a simple thing to do. You know, everything from production to processing, towards governments, to NGOs, civil society, infrastructure, certification, finance, they all interplay and are interdependent in different ways. And the importance is being able to make sense of everything that's going on to really make progress over time. So why do integrated landscape finance versus other approaches? I think this is a slide that also Seth presented, so I'll go through it very, very quickly. It changes from taking like a sector, a supply chain, or a value chain approach where you're trying to maximize for different things, towards really thinking about a place and the sustainability of what that implies between different things, between value chains, between sectors, and between the different governance mechanisms that may exist. So basically, public, private, civil society, how can you actually work together towards a common objective and towards really negotiating what are the priorities? So now moving into a bit of what it looks like, it's important to always bring back the logic that integrated landscape finance and thinking about this as a process approach is really just embedded within integrated landscape management as a whole. At each of these points, there are financial questions and funding questions attached to governance in terms of who will continue to facilitate, who pays for this facilitation, who maintains that facilitation, is someone going to volunteer for it? Even in shared understanding, like if you need to do an analytical or research product to understand the state of the watershed, you need to find support funding or some researcher to do that. Because if not, your shared understanding may be based on faulty data. Vision and planning is the same thing. If you're going to think about spatially planning or spatially targeting or even spatially mapping what is ongoing, kind of to what we were talking about, Charlotte, of like the farmers that exist, you probably need some funding or someone needs to be able to do that. And you need to mobilize them to do that so that you can have that information somewhere. And then in the moment of like taking action, of actually understanding, okay, here's where the farmers are, here's where the watershed is, here's where our priorities are. Now we need to restore these priority areas and we think we need this amount. Then you need to actually think about like, okay, how much does all of that actually cost in the context of a different country? Like how many local currency costs does that mean? How many man days does that mean? How much and who can provide that funding? What kind of funding exists? So this is just to reinforce that the process of integrated landscape finance is really embedded and should be embedded in how you think about all of these things over time. There are certain things that it's possible that you may not be ready to do. You may not be ready to think about mobilizing large-scale investments for farming or for processing because you don't have the partners or you don't have the trust or you don't have, you know, the financial backing to do that. But you can think about how to get to that point and think if it's feasible and desirable to do that. In the meantime, there are a lot of things that you can probably already be doing and you can be making progress on. And it's important to think about both of those things, which is sometimes difficult. Operationally, what am I already doing that I need to continue doing? But then at a higher level, it's also what more do we need to think about to get to that next level? And all of that is a bit of an adaptive process that is embedded kind of within this kind of thinking. And so, yeah, this adaptive process really does entail that you need to think about sometimes multiple sources of finance. And I think the conversation with Charlotte and Raul really magnifies that, where when you think about public finance, it's very different to when you think about private investors or companies. And those are very two different mindsets. But if you're really thinking about the sustainability of a territory and these investments, as a platform, as a facilitator, you need to be able to have them happening in parallel streams. And they're not the same. You may be mobilizing them to a shared objective, but the incentives to why a government will do something, to why a company will do something, will rarely, if ever, match up. Sometimes they do if you're lucky. A lot of times it's unlikely because they speak a different language, they think in different objectives. And honestly, the incentive for the public sector official and for the private sector employee are very different. So those kinds of conversations need to be somewhat differentiated. And kind of associated to, if you're thinking public and private sector, the kind of mechanisms or instruments through which money and funding flows will also likely be different. Working with the public sector tends to be a lot slower. Their finance mechanisms need to be legally set up. The rules need to be super clear. How it's engaged, how it's structured takes a long time. You maybe need to go through like some sort of an application process. Whereas the private sector, they can decide from one day to another to just be like, oh, well, we should invest in this thing. We have discretionary funds and like the money's here. Or you need to go through a grant process to get it. And all of those things are things to keep in mind, kind of the kinds of instruments and the kinds of mechanisms you need to mobilize. And of course, like at the end of the day, it's if you're working in a multi-sector, multi-project, multi-activity perspective, that means you're going to think about different kinds of things that need to be happening. So there's different projects and different activities that may not be implemented in the same way, but they need to be somewhat coordinated. And so what I mean by that and thinking about that is that if you're doing, for example, an investment to do better processing for value add kind of in a value chain, for example, or in agriculture, you need to make sure that that investment makes sense, that you have the inputs of productivity to substantiate that next investment. So in some way, you would need to think about coordinating those so that even though they're completely separate, they might be managed entirely by different entities. But if you're actually thinking about sustainability of a territory and of what's going on as a platform, you need to be talking to say like, okay, if there's a processing facility, how can we connect that to the other things that are happening? And that's really an adaptive process because new investments, new funding, new interest from government or from a company, or even from donors happen all of the time. And you need to be somewhat prepared to try to mobilize them in the direction that you already have and to kind of get them involved as much as you can. Okay. So again, this is kind of the logic of the approach, which is everything I just described. You have kind of objectives at the landscape scale. You're trying to do this multi-activity, multi-sector coordination as much as possible and finding synergies across activities and projects. Ideally, that would be spatially coordinated and kind of sequenced in time to be most synergistic as possible. That's not always possible, but ideally kind of that's the theoretical basis of how to think about it sometimes. And so a key component to simplify this and to think about it from the work that we do is really thinking about developing a portfolio of projects and activities that you can invest. And you can, when I say you, I mean the platform and partners can invest and co-invest into. Now, why is it important to have this? And this again goes back to the same logic of the process and everything. From a lot of the things that we've seen and a lot of the things that we work in, what tends to happen is that there's sometimes a lot of high-level objectives, but there's no pathway towards implementation. And what that means is that if someone shows up tomorrow with $100 million, where would you put the money? Like, are you actually ready for that? And in most landscapes, the answer is a very hard no. There is no pre-preparation to think about, if I want money, I wouldn't know where to put it. I wouldn't actually know what things cost. I wouldn't actually be able to tell you the sustainability of something costs X or costs Y. And from a perspective, kind of from the outside looking in, for someone that wants to invest in sustainability, that's an issue because the basic component that I would want when I'm putting money into something is how much will it take to actually achieve what we're saying and how much is expected from me. And if you can't really have that conversation, it's really hard to have another conversation because it's too contextual in most cases, particularly if you're talking about a very large company. They need to think about your landscape versus other landscapes, your sourcing area versus another. And being able to do that in differentiated ways isn't always helped because there isn't really a process of creating this multi-sector approach and having these platforms where you can also think about where do we need money from someone to do something. And that's what really the landscape investment portfolio is meant to be, is that you're trying to really describe and sequence also for everyone in the platform. It's not just for the investors, but it's also internally to understand what are the things that we need to fund? What are the things that we need to have? And splitting those into two categories is kind of how we've done it so that it's a bit clear that you have a bit more of the enabling investments, which is everything related to like information, the platform, capacity development, spatial analysis of some sort of monitoring to understand that progress is being made and can be reported on because it's being managed in some way. And then on the flip side, it's everything in relation to like, what are investments that are ongoing that may create a return that are more financially sustainable because or their businesses or the government are supporting them that need to be developed or they need to be improved. And so that could be anything from production areas, value chain processing, infrastructure, restoration, all of the things that there's more of an investment case for, but if you don't have the first, it might be harder to do the second. So this is why we split them into both of these categories. And this kind of, I think, shows the complexity and the difficulty of working in this way, which is that there's a lot of demand for better resource management, for using those resources, or for at least proving that that is happening because that's their responsibility or that's their business model. And that includes a wide, variety of sectors and government and financial institutions that are managing those risks, those opportunities. And then on the flip side, you have a lot of the people who are really supplying what's actually going on in terms of practices, projects and activities. And this is more of this isn't like a very clear definition of things. This is simply just an illustration for you to see that it's really important to make sense of all of this that's going on. And having that shared objective can really align people towards moving in a certain direction. And from the funding and finance component, also making sure that those co-investments are made and they're made together rather than in a silo. And I want to make a key point here that I think sometimes gets lost, particularly in a lot of territories and landscapes, is that this also really includes donors, particularly large donors and large programs, which tend to replicate or duplicate things that have already been done because they don't know about it. And so a lot of these platforms, sometimes the most effective investment in this platform is really to just reduce sometimes duplication or doing things that have already failed. And no one will know that things have already been done or they're failed if there isn't actually a space to talk about them, is if there isn't a place to say, look, before you do like all of this stuff, just look at everything we know that's already been done. Here's like the background materials. Here's the strategy. Here's why we're not doing this thing and we are doing that. That logic and that coordination and that communication really can redirect money that would go into things that you may already know are useless or are simply not going to be effective now. So that's kind of a key point, that when you think about finance and like resourcing, it's also to do those components of things that may not show up on a balance sheet or they may not show up in like your donor report. But in terms of actually coordinating for money to go to where it should go, it really can make a difference. So we're going to stop kind of for a breakout group activity that we'll do here actually in plenary. So I think we should take maybe 5 minutes for everyone in the group to reflect on what are the most important activities that you have in progress or that you want to develop in your landscape or your project. And then reflect within those activities or objectives that you may have. What are your current funding sources for each of these investments or each of these projects? Is it enough? Like, is that actually enough funding for what you want to achieve? And if it isn't, how much do you actually estimate you need? And I know that your answers are going to be very varied because you may have different kinds of projects, different kinds of objectives and what you're working on. But this is more of a mental exercise so that you can reflect and we can as a group kind of discuss what are the nuances that may exist in that. So yeah, Patricia, what do you think? 5 minutes for people to reflect for a bit and share?
Yeah, we could do something that called 1, 2, 3 share. Max is here. Max, how does that activity work again? But it's basically 2, 3, 4 share. It's basically take a couple of minutes for yourselves to think and reflect, and then we'll bring it back to the group and share out, something like that. So 5 minutes, you mentioned, Juan. So I'm going to stop the recording, take 5 minutes, piece of paper, just jot down your ideas, your reflections. We'll put the questions back on the screen. Thanks, Juan. And then we'll come back and share with the group in 5 minutes. Any questions? Does everybody understand? All right.
Perfect.
Cool. We ready to come back? Yeah?
Sure, I think so.
All right. How do you want to do this one?
Sorry, I couldn't unmute myself. No, yeah, I think maybe just kind of open the floor to what you thought about, kind of more than the specifics, just kind of where are you in terms of kind of understanding your needs, understanding how much funding you need, what you're actually going to use the funding for, and do you think that yeah, I think just start there actually. Like, where are you in terms of analyzing these questions? Like, do you have clear answers? I think is the first question. And then the second is kind of a bit more of like what you think about how you would get those answers.
Can I add something, Juan? I'd say that, we know that some people are already working in landscape type initiatives, but others aren't. So if you're not, think about just replace the word landscape for project or, the program that you're working in. So think about what are the most important activities for your program of work in your region or in Ricolto or in your office.
Yeah, no, of course. So yeah, maybe we could open the floor. Mafi or Raul, I see your cameras are on, so do you have any reflections or thoughts?
Well, as Ricoto, we've been working at the Yohoa Lake, that is the biggest watershed here in Honduras. And Ricoto has been promoting and facilitating the space for this integrated landscape management and a multi-state platform. And there have been some action that have been taking activities, and some of them has been funded with money from some of the stakeholders and others from the money that we partner with some of the locals there in Yohoa. I believe that we have done some activities in sustainable production and enable environment, especially related to local policies we are promoting. And since the Commonwealth of Amoprolao is the one who have partnered in that area, they also are the ones in charge of protecting the rainforest there in the Yohoa Lake, or the environment in general. And we also have done some other activities about circular economy and let me see, and regenerative agriculture. So, but we've been doing different activities with money from different partners, and we as well with the other program in Ricotta, which is coffee. At some point, we have Ricotta wrote a grant, which hasn't been approved yet. But in general, there have been a lot of activities at small scale. And thinking about what we've been learning in the last couple of sessions, there is a plan that is being developed and is being updated in a regular basis. But for get the impact that we want, I guess we will have more, like you were saying, we need a bigger amount of money or funding that will impact in some way. At the same time, incorporate some other stakeholders. I think it would be appropriate, especially that is really a delicate and fine line with the private sector, because as you mentioned before, and Charlotte as well, their main goal is profit, but involving them in some way that they can be profitable, but respect the ecosystem, and at the same time, they will position themselves as some of these companies that protect the ecosystem, and they will allow them even to be able to get a little extra funding from other sources. So we've been doing a lot of activities in a smaller scale, but we've been getting the support not just of the locals and like the local government offices, but also some of the NGOs, CSOs, and some other partners there in the area. So what I guess it made me make me think about how this sustainable to a long-term phase could move on from what we've been doing to the next step, and how to get this funding to have a bigger impact in the area. I'm not sure that's what we will do.
Yeah, no, I think that's super clear. And if you had to estimate the amount, do you think you know how to get there, or what are, because you mentioned activities in different sectors and getting more stakeholders involved, but like, what does that look like, I think, in more detail?
I wouldn't be able to give you a figure right now, but I think since we have what happened in the Yohoa Lake is we have different type of actors. So you have to, the common share goal have to please in some way everybody, because in the end, everyone is looking for profit except the people who work in protecting the areas. But they have to understand as well that if you don't protect those areas, you don't have a place to work or live in. So that's the key point, to make everyone understand that that's a common space that we live and work. And I think that would be the key. And from them creating long-term sustainable goals for the whole Yohoa Lake. Because in some areas you have more productive areas, and other protection areas, and other more like commercial areas and restaurants and tourism, hotels. So these are a variety of stakeholders in that sense. So to achieve and to put a money, let's say a price tag in the whole thing would be, for me, it's kind of hard to figure out right now.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Raul. Mafi, do you have your camera on? So I'll ask you also some reflections.
Okay, thank you, Juan. And yes, I think now we are like a really small platform, so the actions are like tiny actions, but however, they are important because the last session we had, it was last week, and they presented a map where there was climate stations in the area, in the lake, around the lake, and there was a really red point where there wasn't any stations for climate. And we were talking that why there wasn't any stations in those areas, and that because of the conflict of Santa Catarina Ixtahuacan, that is a social conflict there, and there is really dangerous there now, and they are suspicious about selling and producing drugs there, so no one wants to go there, and the invest isn't there. So we were talking that there will be a lack of information of those areas about the climate, and now the next week they are planning about the next session about the rainy epoca and these sessions are like common, like there's a group of every stakeholder, and everyone puts their point of view of what they should do in this months. So for funding those lunches and the space to talk about that, and now everyone puts a little bit. For example, another organization puts their office so we can go there and discuss. Another puts the lunch, another puts the beverage. And now we are moving like that. And to finish those activities for this year, I think we need at least $10,000, but I don't know where we can get there. Like for a little, everyone must put some, but for the scale that you were talking about earlier, like for the food chain or how much investment we need, we should have that information and we should work on that because we don't know that yet.
Oh, thank you, Mafi. And I mean, at the end, I think the trust building process at the beginning and everything is incredibly important. I think it's easy to like sometimes get too excited and be like, oh, we should already be moving into like funding larger scale or doing more. But the foundational piece, I think, on integrated landscape management is really the trust among stakeholders. And the co-contributions that you're describing, I think, are a great way to really get people more committed, more involved, and creating a lot of that social trust and capital that's required. Yes, Charlotte, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add a couple of thoughts from a concept we're developing for the Green Belt in Ouagadougou in Burkina Faso. And that's actually why colleague Bernadette and Aruna are not here, because they've got a big deadline for funding for the landscape partnership that they need to submit latest tomorrow. And there, so the Green Belt is 2,100 hectares. Already 40 hectares have been kind of restored. It's supposed to provide some kind of protection to the city, but also create a space that is partially productive to also create, income generation opportunities, particularly for internally displaced people. And here, what they want to do is to kind of like scale the model to about 100 hectares just in the next couple of years, which doesn't sound like much, but is actually quite substantial if you look at the state in which it is right now. And I think one of the things that they struggle with is to really try also to get some, again, private sector investment. Because the municipality is fully on board. There's a committee that's been set up under the leadership of the municipality, the council. They have already themselves invested some funds in the restoration, but the scale of it is just too big in the sense that they haven't been willing to provide more. Or haven't been able to really make this a priority compared to other things. So they're really relying on external funding, either international cooperation. In the case of the proposal I mentioned that Bernadette and Aruna are talking about is international climate finance. So the climate fund from Belgium. And yeah, the third option that they're looking at is just CSR funding from companies that operate in the margins of the Green Belt, that would do so as kind of part of their corporate social responsibility. But I think what we struggle with a bit is really to try to see how to mobilize them, how to reach them, how to really make the case for that investment, particularly since it's not directly connected to the business model of these companies. It's not as if you're talking to like cocoa coffee companies. That's an issue of survival and profitability in the long term. That's not the case for these local companies that are active in Ouagadougou. So yeah, it's not really helpful. I'm more asking questions if you've come across anything like that, if you'd have any tips or advice. Also because I'm not working directly in the landscape partnership, but that's the one that I'm the most familiar with right now, just from having read the proposal earlier today. Over to you.
No, thanks, Charlotte. No, I think it's an interesting question. I think for a lot of the local companies, incentive structures are different. It really depends on the motivations they may or may not have. I mean, in some cases, they're just not going to invest, is the reality. In others, though, in Guatemala, actually, the larger like sugar refinery companies in Costa Sur, where they have a massive impact, they're actually the ones who have led a lot of watershed rehabilitation and restoration activities. Definitely terrible in like all social issues, but at least on the ecosystem components, they've realized that they need to do a lot better. And it's really come on the basis of research actually and substantiation of like how it impacts them in different ways. Even like the social license to operate and like the well-being of their workers. All of those are cases that can sometimes be made with local companies, depending on their scope, depending on where they work, what they do. So it's really exploring that and really also developing a lot of more bilateral conversations with the companies to understand why they're interested, if they're interested at all. Because I don't know, in a lot of this work, something that's been incredibly helpful working with other companies and everything, or even investors, is to have a desirability and feasibility matrix where like what's desirable and what's feasible. And really placing that, particularly with companies or like potential investors or potential stakeholders, is really useful because it may be feasible to do something, but it just might not be desirable for them. And it's also the flip side. It might be super desirable for them, but they don't have where to get the money from, like in their business models. And particularly in Latin America and Guatemala, a lot of the issues we have, or sometimes the advantages, is that a lot of the bigger ones are family owned. So if a family kind of cares and you can convince the board, they'll give you money. But if the family doesn't care and they won't even have a conversation with you, it doesn't matter how much data and materiality you can show to them. It's just not going to happen. So it's important to understand also a bit of the governance structures internally for the companies you're engaging with, to understand how their decisions are actually made. And I mean, I think the reality is that in a lot of cases, the sustainability departments of companies have a lot less power than like you would hope they do, and have a lot less ability to influence investment decisions or even corporate social responsibility decision making. So you need to make sure you're also talking to the right person. And with local companies, that's even more important because their structures aren't as formalized. Arguably, I mean, I'd be shocked if they even have a sustainability department, to be honest. In Guatemala, many don't, even if they're very large. And if they do, it's like a person or two. And so you need to find and you need to like figure out who to target so that even if you're making the pitch or you're talking to them, you know that they can actually make a decision on it or not. So not really much of an answer besides like it's important to just like
No, but understand their incentives. Yeah. I guess.
I wonder
Thank
if,
you.
oh, sorry. I wonder if thinking about, because most of the economy usually is moved by the employment that the private sectors generate in that area. I wonder, I mean, not at local level, because usually when you talk about watershed like Yohoa Lake, you should have some policy or incentive or regulation that in some way, of course, protect the ecosystem, because that's the most important thing, but at the same time motivates the private sector to get involved in this kind of a multi-state holder platform. And that way to make them feel at least that they can bring something to the table and that their money is gonna be, I don't know how to put it, like, it's gonna make them look good, not just at local level, but at the national government level, and they could use it like a bargain chip to other activities they do. But I guess one of the things that I was thinking is sometimes, since this is a methodology that is kind of new around the area, even though they've been working in different kind of platforms. So I wonder that the approach to get the private sector involved would be at least to have a key person in that company or enterprise that is kind of like willing to hear and listen how the things work, so he could be like a point of entry for this kind of company.
Yeah, no, it's definitely super important. I mean, ideally, you want to have some sort of a champion to share and like tell other people about it internally in the company. I mean, it's important to also recognize that all the incentives, the way companies are structured, they're not thinking about watersheds in most cases, nor are they thinking about like employees. They're really looking at their profit and loss statements. And it's like, how do we maximize this? Can we do better? So if you can get someone that understands and that's really interested, they can over time build more momentum to how a company can support things. And a lot of that is actually not technical. It's also personal relationships, to be honest, particularly in most geographies. It's getting someone to care and getting them to find a way to champion it and to mobilize things internally as well.
And usually, for example, Yohoa Lake, there is this big company that they produce tilapia. Just as an example, there is another companies, public and private. But most of those companies have this social responsibility branch that they have like a kind of a foundation that probably would be one of the things that a good way to start or approach them. At least they can lead the way to the main company, I believe.
Yeah, no, that is generally a good way, and foundations are good entry points as well, particularly if the families are on the board of the foundation, because if they're involved and they see it more, then it can actually, you can influence over time. But it's important always to see it as a longer term process, because these decisions are never that quick. It's also important to be careful that the private sector doesn't feel you just have them to like get money out of them, because nobody responds well to that. Nobody responds well to like everybody just looking at you with a dollar sign and waiting for you to like hand money out. So it's important to manage those relationships and expectations well, to have better results over time. Okay, so we have about 5 minutes left, so I just want to go through a couple of extra slides before we wrap up to kind of get started, and then I'll leave you like 2 minutes to wrap up, Patricia. We can go from there. Okay, great. So a bit of the question of how to get started is actually really thinking about what you have and what you need to get. And I think one of the most important pieces here is the information you have, and also how reliable is that information, where it's coming from, and even more like who can give you more. And I think in terms of stakeholder platforms, partnerships, and everything, sometimes a lot of partners have a lot of information and have a lot of data, they're not sharing it. But it's really the basis of moving forward to make better decisions. And it's also the basis of substantiating what you're doing over time. So everything we talked about in terms of evidence, in terms of showing progress, in terms of showing why you're doing something and why you shouldn't do other things, or why you should prioritize something, should really be based on the information available. And that process and that exercise of gathering information and then seeing where you need more of and mobilizing sense making to get more of that information to understand, for example, where is most of deforestation happening? Like, are the drivers actually agriculturally motivated, or is that just an assumption you have that hasn't been validated? And if that is actually what's going on, where is it happening? Spatially, can you actually map it out to target interventions to focus on that issue more effectively? All of that is really going to be dependent on the quality of the information you have. And getting to that point takes time. It's not easy. And a lot of it is also based on trust. Not everyone is just going to give you free information unless they believe in why or how you're going to use that information. And here it's also important that information and data have privacy components to it that you need to be aware of. And not everyone may use the information the right way. So if information is provided, how will it be managed? Who manages it? Are also questions to consider, so that it's not used improperly as well. So funding, we talked about this already quite a bit, which is just like different types of funding and investments come from different places. So what's already there? What's the easiest to already access and to mobilize? Where can you start? And also understand what may already exist that you're not aware of. Are there other, for example, public sector funding windows that you haven't mapped out? Are there grant opportunities that you aren't aware of? In the platform, can you facilitate that flow of information so that you can plan more effectively as a group? And the other point that's really important is also time scale. So when we talk about finance from the private sector in particular, financial capital, because of what I mentioned at the beginning, because it has a cost and a value of time where you have to pay for like having the money for a certain period of time, everything is about maximizing shorter term returns. The logic is not longer term sustainability. But for what most sustainability initiatives need, you need longer terms of funding. And that is also true for grants and for projects. Sometimes it would be better if you could get a 20-year grant with a lot less money, knowing that you'd have 20 years to do very specific things, than getting 5 years for a lot of money. But that's not really how things work. And so how do you plan for longer term cycles, understanding that most of the time your contracts are shorter? And how can you build in some sort of strategy to like align to that longer term time scale is things that you need to actively think about and plan for. So when you're thinking about getting started in integrated landscape finance and everything, all of it is really going to be based on the process that you have underlying it. And so it's important to really think about how to maintain that process first, because things are built on it, but you need to build on it as well. So thinking about this timescale is really an important component to think about. And so I'll stop there because I know we're out of time. But in the next session on action planning, we'll get into kind of a bit more detail. I'll very quickly mention we have tools and approaches where we've been testing this kind of thing over time. And we can share those out as well, kind of as the sessions progress and kind of, yeah, and as we get more understanding of things.
Thanks.
So, go ahead.
Thanks so much. So yeah, we just have 1 minute left. So I'm going to very quickly I wanted to come back to this, to the integrated landscape finance framework first to understand where we are and what we're doing next week. So we talked about the development of a vision and strategy and the shared vision module, and we backtracked a bit to get the background on what ILF really is. But as Juan mentioned, it's really important to have an action plan when thinking about finance, so that you know what you're going to invest in, what your finance needs are, and to continue the process. So the next session is really going to focus on action plan from a high level, but we're going to be trying to incorporate some of these ILF elements into the action plan. So that's what's coming next. We do have a breakout, a homework discussion to leave you with. So these are the questions here. I'll share them in the follow-up email. This is really, if you guys feel comfortable taking this a step further, taking these conversations a step further with your groups, then we suggest you meet with other colleagues from Ricolto, from your landscape, from your country, from your region, and here are some discussion prompts just for you to continue thinking about the ILF questions and concepts, and maturing the ideas a little bit more. And that's it. We will see you guys on May 21st for the next session. I hope you will have a wonderful week.
Hi, thank you, Patricia and Juan. I just wanted to say, I think we'll follow up bilaterally also with all the colleagues to make sure that attendance is higher in the next session. I think there was a bit of an issue with the agenda this week because of all the events and that deadline for the Belgian government funding that's coming up tomorrow. But yeah, just to let you know that we'll chase everyone and yeah. But yeah, thank you so much for the session. I think it was really interesting, really good conversation as well, which is sometimes easier in a smaller group. So thank you both, and thank you to all the colleagues.
Thank you so much, Charlotte. And just so you know,
Thank you all.
far has been pretty good. This is the week that it dropped off, but so far it had been okay. And thank you, Juan, so much for facilitating. I know this is not the easiest topic to navigate, so I think we improvised really well and adapted the session well. And thank you everybody for participating and sharing your stories, Matthew and Juan and Harold and Charlotte. All right, bye everybody. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Bye.
Thank
you.
you. Bye
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.
I think